Hello, welcome to The Koi Farmer, where we focus on cultivating clarity in the complicated world of pharmacy benefits. I'm Justine. I'm a pharmacist with 20 years of experience in the business of pharmacy, and today in our Drug Pricing Index series, we're going to be breaking down some of the key differences in contracting on the basis of AWP, or Average Wholesale Price, and NADAC, or National Average Acquisition Cost. Thanks for joining us. If you haven't seen our individual episodes on AWP and NADAC, please feel free to go back and review those for additional detail. Today we'll be talking through some of the basics of these different pricing indexes and how they differ, some ways to put into practice when folks use one or the other basis for contracting, and finally, some fine print on how you can apply NADAC versus AWP contracting to your business. Let's dive in.
You're looking for the cure, but you're stuck in the weeds, bringing you insights into pharmacy.
First, we'll review each of the acronyms. We'll walk through some key comparisons between AWP and NADAC. In practice, we'll talk about how PBMs contract on either an AWP or a NADAC basis for buying and selling drugs. We'll talk about how some folks in the industry perceive inflation and predictability of these two indexes. And then finally, we'll talk about how plan decisions are made, especially in cases where there may be one deal on the table that's AWP based and one deal on the table that's NADAC based. How can you tell the difference? What questions should you ask your consultant to make sure you're getting the best deal possible? So getting things kicked off with AWP, which stands for Average Wholesale Price. Then moving on, we'll continue to talk about the topic of NADAC. Some folks like to say NADAC. I like to say NADAC. Tomato, tomato. NADAC stands for National Average Drug Acquisition Cost. There are some key differences in these two indexes that are worth mentioning as we set the stage for comparing these two. So the first difference is who sets the index. So in the case of AWP, drug manufacturers set the AWP and the associated WAC, or wholesale acquisition cost, for a given product. In the case of NADAC, the pharmacies are reporting their wholesale invoice amounts into CMS in order to inform the NADAC index amount. Who oversees each of these processes? In the case of AWP, there's very limited oversight, and generally this process is dictated by the manufacturer. In the case of NADAC, CMS, or the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, is the ultimate overseer and publisher of this index. How are people able to get a hold of the information from each of these indexes? In the case of AWP, AWP is only available via proprietary compendia sources. This typically includes Medispan or First Data Bank, which are paid subscription services that most industry players subscribe to. In the case of NADAC, this is a publicly available data set that is published weekly by CMS. When looking at which index is most comprehensive, AWP takes the cake. All manufacturers report an AWP on each NDC, or National Drug Code, of a particular drug product in the market upon launch. In the case of NADAC, there are really quite a broad depth and breadth of drugs that are covered by the index, but it's not necessarily 100% comprehensive. From a publishing schedule standpoint, there are also a few key differences. AWP is typically updated weekly by Medispan and First Data Bank on Sundays. NADAC, on the other hand, is published weekly as well to the CMS website on Wednesdays. Despite being published weekly, there's a period where there's typically more movement in the index than others. In the case of AWP, manufacturers tend to reset the AWP, or the average wholesale price, both in July and January, and those are the most common periods of highest movement in this index. In the case of NADAC, the largest changes typically come from movement in the survey data, which is included in the monthly outputs of the NADAC files. Although there are typically some fixes and some generic drug movements in the weekly files for NADAC, the monthly updates tend to contain the larger or more survey-based changes. So now that we've talked about some of the basics of AWP versus NADAC, let's talk about how PBMs contract on these two bases, some different advantages and disadvantages of these indexes based on inflation and predictability of the index. For a particular PBM, we'll call this PBMB in this instance, the PBM wants to contract with a plan sponsor and a pharmacy on the same cost basis to remove risks of one of the indexes moving in a way that does not align with the other index. So you'll see here PBMB is contracting on the basis of AWP with both pharmacies and plan sponsors. There may be other PBMs or other PBM contract sets that are contracting on the basis of NADAC. So for example, PBM A may contract with the plan sponsors and pharmacies on the basis of NADAC and not on the basis of AWP, or they may have a particular network where they're contracted with the plan sponsor and they're contracting the pharmacy network in that instance on the basis of NADAC. This is a really high-level example of how a contract might look on a NADAC basis or an AWP basis for plan sponsors and pharmacies contracting with a PBM. I want to talk through a couple of the key differences that commonly are found in these types of contracts. As plan sponsors evaluate different contract options in the marketplace, they often will convert the contracts into AWP terms as they evaluate which contract might be more favorable. So this is an example of how a plan sponsor or a pharmacy might interpret an offer for a contract on the basis of either NADAC or AWP. When converting to a similar basis, each of these contracts may look at the surface like they have different advantages. In the case of NADAC, generic drug pricing tends to look slightly more favorable in the projected ingredient cost area than an AWP-based pricing module. In this example, we're showing a somewhat typical setup where a NADAC-based contract would offer a dispensing fee. These dispensing fees could range anywhere between $8 and $15 or more. This contract also includes an administrative fee. Illustrated here, we have a traditional AWP deal where the PBM may be reimbursing pharmacies slightly less than they are charging plan sponsors for their services. Therefore, there's no dispensing fee or admin fee on this claim in the AWP-based contract. Another key difference that is sometimes found when comparing NADAC versus AWP contracts is that NADAC contracts are often contracted on a pass-through basis. That means that the pharmacies are generally paid the same amount that the plan sponsors are billed. In this example, you can see that the pharmacy is paid AWP minus 91, which is exactly what the plan sponsor will get invoiced for. In the AWP-based contracting example, this is again a traditional deal where potentially the pharmacy gets reimbursed slightly less than the plan sponsors pay for the drug claim. This helps the PBM cover their cost for administering the claims adjudication process. There is a fantastic debate in the industry about whether AWP or NADAC is a better basis for contracting, and there are several reasons and several valid ideas around this concept. This particular graph is created by Capital RX, who is a major PBM who typically contracts on the basis of NADAC with many of their clients. This is looking at industry data from 2018 to 2024, showing that for generic products, AWP is relatively stable or potentially slightly increasing. In the case of the NADAC index, the NADAC has consistently deflated over time. PBMs like Capital RX assert that this is an advantage if you have a particular contract that follows the basis of NADAC or AWP. A plan sponsor may pay less over time if they're following a deflating index. There are, however, many ways to look at this. We'll talk in the fine print section about how it's really critical to forecast the performance of an index, and this may be more important than deflation in making sure that as a plan sponsor, you are getting the best deal on a particular drug. In the case of AWP, the index is quite stable, and although it may be slightly inflating, it is very predictable in this case. Consultants typically model somewhat of an increase in WAC and AWP year over year as they're looking at different deals. However, if, for example, a consultant were modeling a deal in 2015, they may have thought that inflation may be around 10%. However, as some of the years of the contract went on, inflation in AWP and WAC tended to decrease over time. This can lead to a tailwind in what the plan sponsors actually pay and potentially lead them to pay slightly less than they had originally thought for the same products. We talked in the NADAC section about how only certain pharmacies report to CMS their acquisition costs. Typically, these are some of the smaller pharmacies, and the chains do not report into the index. In 2024, it's believed that there was a small area where potentially some of the larger chains suddenly reported into the index. This created some volatility in the index, which may be potentially acutely favorable for plan sponsors. However, it can create some unpredictability and reimbursement instability for pharmacies, which can ultimately lead to problems in the drug channel. Debating whether AWP or NADAC is the best basis to contract with pharmacies and plan sponsors on is a heavily debated topic. I'm not here to necessarily say that one way to contract is necessarily better or worse than the other. I'm interested in highlighting some of the key differences between these two drug indexes, and also how you can look at different contracts and evaluate them correctly or with the best accuracy to make informed decisions. And I believe that understanding the way that each of these indexes work is the cornerstone of being able to make good decisions as a payer. So I'm going to go through in the fine print section a couple of examples where maybe a consultant forecasted one thing and then potentially the forecast came true, or there was some kind of a change ultimately that came to fruition in the inflation that ultimately happened. And then I will round out with some of the consultant questions that you can ask to make sure if you have a NADAC-based or an AWP-based contract that you really want to be thinking about in your PBM contract. What I'd like to do next is to talk through how a consultant may forecast to a plan sponsor how a NADAC-based pricing contract may work out for a particular sponsor, or how an AWP-based contract may work out for a particular sponsor. In this example, I have an example drug where the current NADAC is sitting at $420. The reimbursement rate in the contract is NADAC plus $11 dispensing fee. In the AWP contract, we have a current AWP of $500 for a particular drug, with an average of brand drugs being reimbursed at AWP minus 19.5, and again, $0 dispensing fee given this is a traditional deal. So let's talk through which deal a payer should take. So in my first example, a consultant may look at a deal based on NADAC and a deal based on AWP and project some different inflation rates. NADAC is typically inflating slowly or potentially even deflating. AWP typically inflate at a higher rate than NADAC, and a lot of consultants will model this as they look at the projected cost. So in this case, we have this product. The projected cost for each of these different indexes would be $471 in the third contract year. In actuality, if the actual inflation comes in at the same rate as projected inflation for both of these indexes, the actual cost would be the same. So either one of these contracts would be equivalent deals. The fine print comes in where projected inflation doesn't necessarily match what was projected. So in this particular example, an AWP-based deal would have a projected cost of $465.94 if there was a 5% inflation. The NADAC deal would have a slightly higher projected cost if there were a 3% inflation. When this actually plays out a year later, the NADAC deal may actually be a better cost if the AWP inflation exceeds the projection of the consultant. So in this case, the actual inflation was 1% higher than projected, leading the NADAC deal to have actually been the better deal for the plan sponsor. In another example, the NADAC deal may look favorable on the surface. The consultant projected a 3% inflation for NADAC, a 6% inflation for the AWP-based deal, and the projected cost of the NADAC deal is lower than that of the AWP deal. In actuality, in this particular example, the NADAC price actually inflated 5%. The AWP inflation held steady at the 6% as projected, and therefore the AWP deal was actually the better deal for this plan sponsor. I give these couple of examples to show how what your consultant models deeply matters in making sure that plan sponsors are able to have good and well-informed decisions when comparing especially AWP-based deals and NADAC deals head-to-head. This can be one of the most difficult components as a consultant, and in my prior days as a consultant, this was something my partners and I talked about very often. So one of the questions that could be helpful to ask, what are the inflation and deflation metrics that are being used for each cost model to be able to forecast forward what the costs in the future might be? Secondly, if you're looking at an AWP-based deal, one of the key components is that AWP, again, has historically increased over time. Therefore, if you're accepting a deal that has a flat rate in it or modest improvements year over year, so for example, as a plan sponsor, you're paying for brand drugs at AWP minus 19 and you're paying for generic drugs at AWP minus 89. As AWP increases, as a plan sponsor, you will pay more. And so renegotiating via market check and constant renewal provisions or potentially a term for convenience clause can be very important in an AWP deal. In a NADAC-based deal, since the index is typically deflating to some extent or inflating slowly, market checks and renewals are important, but potentially not as valuable as in an AWP deal to really be the sticking point of the negotiation. And then lastly, if you're looking at a NADAC-based contract, there are some key areas of the contract that need focus because of some of the gaps that exist in the index. So making sure that you have tied out how are rates for new-to-market drugs handled and how are rates, especially for specialty drugs, handled in the contract, whether this is on an AWP basis for those drugs that don't have a NADAC, whether there's some other kind of default rate included. This can be very important in making sure that all drugs have a price in a contract that's based on NADAC. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of The Koi Farmer. I expect there'll be a great deal of debate on AWP versus NADAC, as there certainly is a lot to be read out there. I haven't covered these topics comprehensively, but I hope that I've covered some of the key points that can help folks easily differentiate between some of the pros and cons of each of these indexes for contracting basis. If you found this episode helpful, please consider liking, subscribing, providing feedback on our website at www.thekoifarmer.com. You can also submit an inquiry on the website if you're interested in any training packages or bespoke consulting services from our firm. Thanks for sticking with us through this episode. We hope to see you next time.
You're looking for the cure, but you're stuck in the weeds. Bringing you insights into pharmacy. The Koi Farmer, cultivating clarity, opening doors.